Welcome back to our Science ACT overview. Today we're going to look at data and all the ways that it can be presented to us on the Science ACT. We will begin by doing an activity that's brought to us by Turner's Graph of the Week. Take a few moments to consider this graph and talk to your neighbor about what you think this graph represents. Notice that we're missing quite a bit of information here. Any guesses as what this could pertain to? What if I gave you a little more information? Here we have the x-axis and a high point and a low point. It's pretty safe to say that the numbers along the bottom represent years. However, that doesn't give us any better indication as to what this graph represents. What if I now give you the y-axis? Now that you have a little bit more information, you can probably start to make some better guesses. But still, probably not enough information to tell us what this graph is actually about. What if I also gave you this picture? Now do you have any better guesses? If you guessed that this graph was talking about teenage pregnancies, then you would be correct. This is showing us pregnancies from the years 1940 to the years 2010. Notice along the bottom that we have our time frame. And along the side, these numbers represent the number of pregnancies per 1,000 teenage girls during that particular year. We also have a title and a sentence that explains what we're looking at and why this data is significant. What do you think the teen birth rate might be in the year 2020? Do you think there will be an upward trend or a downward trend? Tell somebody why around you. Make sure that you reference the graph that's in front of you. This is a great example of the type of graph that you might see during the ACT. And this question, what you think the birth rate might be in 2020, is an excellent example of the type of question that the ACT writers are going to ask you. What they're looking for is that you'll say that there's a downward trend based off of the information that you see from 1957 to 2009. Be sure to pay attention to all the information that you're given in a graph. But remember, you're trying to gather as much information as you can, as quickly as you can, because you have a limited amount of time to answer each question. Let's take some time now to look at some actual data representation visuals from past ACTs to see what information we can gather from them. Here are two figures from a passage. Notice that on the x-axis we're measuring time in days, and on the y-axis we're measuring percentage. However, the important part to look at here is the key above the figures. Here we're looking at 15%, and here we're looking at 5%. Make sure that you're paying attention to those two numbers because questions will ask you about one figure specifically, and you need to know which one is our 15% and which one is our 5%. Notice too that both graphs have a downward trend. You may get a question that asks you to compare the trends of the two figures shown. This is another example of a data visual you may see on an ACT. Notice here that we're looking at sugar and percent yeast, but we're also comparing strain N to strain X. You should also pay attention to the way that your numbers are progressing as you move down a column. Notice here that my numbers are getting bigger, but here my numbers are getting smaller. That up and down arrow heading in opposite directions is a visual representation of numbers that are inversely proportional, which means that as one thing increases, another thing decreases. Notice you see the same thing represented below. Pay attention to trends like this. Here's another example of a table where instead of giving you numbers, it's giving you letters to represent changes in your variable. Notice here that we see a change of pH. This is our independent variable, the thing that we're changing. And below, we're given our data as a set of letters to represent different colors. We should note here that one of the things the ACT does expect you to know before coming into the test, that a pH of 0 to 7 represents an acidic solution. This visual here is actually an example of an experimental setup. But notice below that it tells you that there are 25 cups containing a total of 250 A1 seedlings. Pay attention to small bits of information like this, because there may be a question that asks you how many seedlings are in each cup. You should be able to calculate in your head that there are 10 seedlings in each cup. This is the most that the ACT will ask you to calculate without a calculator. This is a visual that may be a little bit more intimidating to some. On one side we have pressure, and on the other side we have average temperature. And in the middle we have a series of colors that are representing different types of clouds. If you look up in the key above, it associates each color with a type of cloud that you're looking at. While this can tell you a lot of information, it's very easy to overlook the other things that are existing in this figure. For instance, the downward trend of temperature and the upward trend of pressure. Keep in mind that it's very likely that you will see a question that asks you about that information, so try not to overlook little details like that. Here we have a bar graph that is looking at two different experiments, comparing the survival of fish species from bacteria-filtered water to unfiltered water. We have our fish species listed along the bottom, and the percentage of fish that survive to adulthood off to the side. When you see a visual like this, you'll often be asked to compare the results from two separate sets of data. For instance, you may be asked where the largest gap is between bacteria-filtered water and unfiltered water, or you may be asked to compare your results from C to D. Here is an example of a table that can be used as a reference table. While this may seem overwhelming with lots of numbers and lots of different chemicals listed up top, what's important to pay attention to here is the trends. Notice, here I have a temperature increase, and with these 4 chemicals, I see a similar increase as my temperature rises. This is what's called a directly proportional relationship. However, with these 2 chemicals, I see that my trend runs in the opposite direction. This is what's called an inversely proportional relationship. Pay attention to these 2 particular chemicals, because it's likely that these will be the chemicals that are asked about in some of the questions. In fact, it is in your best interest to draw these arrows on your charts when you get the passage. You may come across a graph that looks similar to this one, which can be very overwhelming at first, but rest assured that you will be likely asked to identify a certain point on the graph. For instance, if I have a pressure of 6 and a temperature of 300, what spot am I in? Clearly, I'm in the section D. Lastly, you may be given some elaborate visuals of the experiment and asked to identify the difference between the 2 visuals. For instance, here we notice that we have leaves off to the right, whereas here we do not. Regardless of the visuals that are given to you, remember that there is a lot of information that can and must be gathered in a very short period of time. Know that you're not expected to understand the complete experiment, but rather to identify trends and to use these visuals as reference sheets for answering questions. The next 3 days we'll be looking at the 3 types of passages and recapping over the 5 types of questions that you will see on this test. That's all for today. Thank you.